This is a rare Ethiopian Orthodox Bible manuscript, handwritten in Ethiopia's sacred liturgical language, Ge'ez.
There is a monastery in the northern highlands of Ethiopia where the wind never seems to stop moving, and where, for as long as anyone can remember, one old monk has always been the last to fall asleep. For 60 years, one such monk kept a single duty above all others, to guard a set of manuscripts that, according to the monastery's own oral history, have been copied and recopied since the earliest centuries of the Christian faith. He never explained why he guarded them so closely. He simply did. And when he finally lay dying, surrounded by pages darker with age than the walls around him, he called his brothers close and told them it was time they understood what they had been protecting. This is that story, passed down through Ethiopian monastic tradition, shaped by centuries of retelling, and offered here not as settled history, but as a legend worth sitting with. To understand why anyone would spend a lifetime guarding a book, you first have to understand what most people outside Ethiopia have never been told. The Bible most of the world reads is not the only Bible that exists. The Western canon, the one familiar to Catholics and Protestants alike, settled somewhere around 66 books after centuries of councils, debates, and edits. The Ethiopian Orthodox Church never followed that same path. Its canon is wider, by some counts as many as 81 books, including texts like Enoch and Jubilees that were quietly set aside everywhere else. These were not forgeries invented in Africa. They were texts that circulated among Jewish and early Christian communities long before Rome ever convened a council. Ethiopia simply never let them go. That difference alone would be enough to make Ethiopian Christianity a subject worth studying. But the monk's tradition claims something more specific. It claims that tucked among the manuscripts of the Ethiopian Church is a text, referred to in this telling as the Manuscripts, the Book of the Covenant, that does something no widely known Western gospel does. It fills in the silence. Here is the silence in question. In the account most familiar to Western readers, the risen Christ appears to his followers, offers a blessing, and ascends, and the 40 days between resurrection and ascension are compressed into barely a few lines. 40 days. One of the most theologically loaded stretches of time in the entire Christian story, and it arrives to most readers as almost nothing. According to the tradition the monk protected, that emptiness was never meant to stay empty. The Manuscripts in this telling claims to record what filled it. According to the legend, what the risen Christ delivered in that window was not comfort so much as instruction, urgent, plain-spoken, and aimed less at the next life than at the shape of the one his followers were about to build. The first teaching, as the story is told, warns against mistaking buildings for divinity. Do not build temples of stone, for stone crumbles. Build the temple within, for it does not. Read as legend. It becomes a warning aimed squarely at every institution that would later raise itself in his name. A warning that religion, taken as architecture and hierarchy alone, risks becoming the very thing it was meant to guard against. The second teaching, in this same tradition, goes further. It claims the kingdom of heaven is not a place accessed through any external gate, but something already present inside a person, found, if anywhere, in the quiet that exists between one thought and the next. It is easy to see why a teaching like that, if it had spread widely into a world built on temples, tithes, and intermediaries, might have unsettled institutions that depended on people believing they needed someone else to reach the divine. Whether or not the words are original, the idea itself has echoed through mystical traditions across nearly every religion, that the sacred is found within, not merely administered from without. The third and final teaching, and the one the dying monk was said to return to again and again, is the strangest. According to the legend, Christ warned his disciples that a darkness would come, and that when it did, it would not announce itself as darkness. It would wear a familiar face. It would speak familiar words. It would build in his name the very things he had just warned them against. Interpreters within this tradition have long read that warning less as a prediction of a single villain and more as a caution about systems, about the way good intentions calcify into structures that serve power instead of the people they claim to serve. None of this is presented here as proven historical fact. It survives, as far as anyone outside a small circle of monastic tradition can verify, as an oral and manuscript legend, the kind of story a monastery might tell about itself for 1,000 years, true or not, because the story does real work in the lives of the people who tell it. The monk's tradition does not stop with the words themselves. It layers them with something closer to a description of the human condition. In this telling, every person carries within them two forces, spoken of as two winds, a wind of life and a wind of error. The wind of error is described not simply as bad behavior, but as something almost parasitic, entering through greed, through the eyes, through careless speech, and slowly hardening a living person into someone who moves through their days without any real inner life at all. The image used in the tradition is a stark one, a walking tomb, a body still in motion, but a heart gone quiet. It's a haunting image regardless of its provenance, and it's easy to understand why a monk who spent 60 years in near total silence might find it especially resonant. The remedy offered in this tradition is described using a word borrowed from far older Mediterranean religious vocabulary, gnosis, direct inward knowing, rather than knowledge mediated entirely by an institution. The instruction attached to it is almost meditative. Watch your own thoughts the way a guard watches a gate, alert to what enters and what leaves. Whatever its true origin, this instruction sits comfortably alongside contemplative practices found across many religious traditions, Christian and otherwise, that emphasize inward attention over outward ritual alone. If the teachings themselves are the heart of the legend, the physical setting of the story is what gives it such staying power. Ethiopia is home to genuine, well-documented treasures that long predate any of this monk's lifetime, and it's worth separating what is independently verifiable from what belongs to legend. What is verifiable? The Garima Gospels, housed in an Ethiopian monastery, have been radiocarbon dated by outside researchers to sometime between the 4th and 7th centuries, making them among the oldest illustrated Christian manuscripts known to exist anywhere in the world. That dating is real, published, and remarkable on its own terms. No embellishment required. While political fragmentation and conflict disrupted manuscript production in parts of the wider Christian world during that period, Ethiopian scribes were producing, illustrating, and preserving texts that still survive today. What is legend? Passed down for centuries rather than confirmed by outside evidence. Ethiopia's own royal chronicle, the Kebir Nagast, tells of a queen of Sheba who traveled to Jerusalem, met Solomon, and returned home carrying his son Menelik. The same chronicle claims that a grown Menelik later visited his father's court and on his way home brought back the Ark of the Covenant, leaving a copy behind in Jerusalem. It is a story with no independent archaeological confirmation, but it is also a story Ethiopia has told about itself without wavering for closer to 3,000 years, and it sits at the very center of Ethiopian national and religious identity even today. The Ethiopian Orthodox Church maintains, as a matter of living practice rather than mere folklore, that the true Ark now rests inside the Church of Our Lady Mary of Zion in the ancient city of Aksum, guarded, according to church tradition, by a single monk chosen for life, who enters the chapel that houses it and does not leave again. No outsider has been permitted to view it directly in modern times, which is precisely why the claim remains impossible to verify one way or the other. Popular retellings sometimes describe strange physical effects reported by generations of guardians, or frame the object in the language of contained energy rather than religious relic. But these details belong to legend and speculation, not to anything independently documented, and they're worth holding loosely rather than repeating as established fact. What is documented is this: European crusading orders, including the Knights Templar, are recorded by some historians as having traveled into the Ethiopian highlands during the medieval period, and their carved symbols do appear on stone churches in the town of Lalibela, physical evidence that outsiders came seeking something in that region, whatever their true purpose. And Ethiopia's resistance to European colonization is very real history, not legend. At the Battle of Adwa in 1896, Ethiopian forces defeated an invading Italian army, making Ethiopia the only African nation to successfully repel a European colonial power during the height of the so-called Scramble for Africa. Ethiopian oral memory of that day is rich with imagery of divine favor. Military historians, more soberly, point to terrain, tactics, and the unity of Ethiopian forces under Emperor Menelik II. Both readings of that victory coexist, and neither one erases the plain historical fact of what Ethiopian soldiers accomplished that day. Then there is Lalibela itself, 11 churches carved not built, cut directly downward out of solid volcanic rock, complete with windows, interior chambers, and drainage systems, all worked from single continuous formations of stone. This, too, is not legend. It is a UNESCO World Heritage Site that anyone can visit today. Traditionally attributed to King Lalibela in the 12th century, the churches represent an engineering feat that continues to draw serious study from architects and historians, many of whom note how difficult it is to reconstruct exactly how such precise, error-intolerant excavation was accomplished with the tools believed available at the time. Ethiopian religious tradition credits divine assistance in the work, angels laboring alongside human hands, according to church legend. Historians offer more grounded, if still incomplete, explanations involving skilled labor, long construction timelines, and techniques not fully recorded. The honest answer is that some of the details of how Lalibela was built remain genuinely debated, and that uncertainty is more interesting than any single tidy explanation, supernatural or otherwise. The monk's tradition ties these architectural and scriptural threads together into something larger. The idea that Ethiopia was never merely a distant outpost of the Christian world, but a place entrusted, by story, if not by verified history, with something the wider world was never meant to fully see. Whether that something is a physical object, a body of suppressed teaching, or simply the resilience of a faith community that refused to let its own scriptural tradition be flattened to match everyone else's, is left, appropriately, to the listener to decide. There is one more thread in Ethiopian tradition worth naming honestly, because it carries real cultural weight, even though it cannot be verified as literal fact. Ethiopia's Solomonic dynasty, which by tradition traced its founding to that same meeting between Solomon and the Queen of Sheba, ruled in some form for centuries, ending with Emperor Haile Selassie in 1974. Selassie's traditional royal title, Conquering Lion of the Tribe of Judah, echoes imagery from the Book of Revelation, and it was this echo, layered onto Ethiopia's long resistance to colonization and its position as a symbol of black sovereignty, that led the Rastafari movement in the 20th century to regard Selassie as a messianic figure. That belief belongs to the realm of faith and cultural meaning, not to anything historians can confirm about literal descent from any biblical figure, and Selassie himself, for what it's worth, never publicly claimed divinity. It's worth being equally honest about one more thing. No credible historical or genetic evidence establishes a biological bloodline running from Jesus of Nazareth into any royal house, Ethiopian or otherwise, and no legitimate DNA study has ever confirmed such a claim. Genetic research on Ethiopian populations has identified ancient connections to communities in the Levant, consistent with long-documented trade and migration across the Red Sea over thousands of years, real and interesting findings in their own right, but not proof of any specific biblical genealogy. Where legend reaches for certainty that history cannot supply, the honest move is to say so plainly, rather than dress speculation up as discovery. Which brings the story back to the monk and to the question his final night is remembered as raising. Why tell any of this now? The tradition offers its own answer, and it is worth hearing on its own terms, even without accepting it as literal prophecy. The monk is remembered as saying that the warnings attributed to those 40 hidden days were never meant as abstract theology, but as something closer to a survival guide, meant to be understood only once the world it described had actually arrived. A world, in his words, built on illusion, voices carried without bodies present, images that outlast the truth they claim to represent, communication traveling faster than understanding. Whether or not those words were ever truly spoken in the first century, it isn't hard to see why a monk living at the edge of a rapidly connecting, image-saturated modern world might feel they had finally found their moment. There is something genuinely moving in that image regardless of whether every historical claim behind it holds up. An old man, having spent 60 years in near silence with the same handful of pages, deciding on his final night that the words mattered too much to die with him. Traditions like this endure not because every detail can be independently verified, but because they carry something true about the tension between institutions and inner life, between inherited authority and personal conviction, that every generation seems to rediscover for itself. The honest ending to this story isn't a revelation. It's an invitation to take Ethiopia's genuinely rich and independently significant Christian history seriously on its own terms, the real manuscripts, the real architecture, the real endurance of a faith that charted its own course for 2,000 years, and to hold the more extraordinary legends surrounding it exactly as legends, valuable for what they say about the people who have carried them, rather than as settled fact. The tradition speaks of may or may not hold what the story claims. But the fact that people have kept returning to it for centuries, guarding it, retelling it, dying with its words on their lips, is itself a kind of truth worth paying attention to.